there was a heated debate in the United Nations Security Council about the Hamas attacks on Israel and now Israel's subsequent response to those attacks. While speaking at the debate, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a direct comparison between Hamas and Lashkar-e-Taiba and ISIS. He even compared the painful events of October 7th and what ordinary Israelis had to go through. He made a direct comparison of that with 26/11 and what Indians had to go through, and with 9/11, America's own worst terror attack on its soil. The comparison might be apt. If it is, and these were all terror attacks, no doubt about it, terror attacks which targeted innocent civilians who had no means to fight back, neither were they directly involved in whatever political grievance may be behind those terror attacks. The question then is, why is the international community insisting that Israel and India and the United States and other civilized nation states which follow the rule of law have to also follow the rules of war? Did Hamas follow the rules of war when it attacked children, elderly, women, non-combatants who have nothing to do with whatever underlying political grievances there are? Should the rules of war apply only to nation states? And certainly it should apply to nation states. It's no one's case that it should not. But if it does apply to nation states, how can you then say that it should also apply to terrorist outfits, whether it is Hamas, whether it is Lashkar, because they are not playing by the rules of the game. And if they are not playing, you have an enemy, an adversary who's not playing by the rules of the game, then why are nation states then expected to still play by the rules of the game? But first, the story.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation.
Nevertheless, the Secretary General and numerous UN officials immediately accepted the claims of baby-killing terrorists. What a disgrace.
Faces of mothers, craved with pain, hiding children, dripping with fear? No, I don't want to remember. Mr. Secretary General, in what world do you live? Definitely, this is not our world.
All acts of terrorism are unlawful and unjustifiable, whether they target people in Nairobi or Bali, in Luxor, Istanbul, or Mumbai.
Our heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims and prayers for speedy recovery of the injured. Our Prime Minister clearly spelled out that those involved must be held responsible.
All right, so America's message at the United Nations Security Council, and this was Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, who said it. He drew the analogy between 26/11 and what happened on 10/7. All acts of terrorism are unlawful and unjustifiable, whether they target people in Nairobi or in Bali, in Mumbai or in New York or Kibbutz Be'eri. Whether they are carried out by ISIS or by Boko Haram, Lashkar-e-Taiba or by Hamas. Whether victims are targeted for their faith, ethnicity, nationality, or any other reason, this council, the United Nations Security Council, has a responsibility to denounce member states that arm, fund, train Hamas or any other terrorist group that carries out such horrific acts. Now, it's interesting that something as basic as this, that you cannot have armed combatants taking on unarmed civilians for whatever reason they choose to, you cannot play by the established rules of rule of law, rules of war, civilized world behavior for such barbarians. Now, there was a big debate that happened at the UN Security Council. Antonio Guterres, who's the UN Security Council, said that the October 7th attacks did not occur in a political vacuum. Israel has responded by saying that Palestinian cause, howsoever justifiable it may be, does not justify the kind of crimes that Hamas perpetrated on innocent Israeli civilians on October 7th. Mr. Guterres went on to say that Palestinians have been subjected to suffocating occupation, and he may be right. Yes, Gazans have been subjected to this occupation. Those in the West Bank have been subjected to this occupation. Israel's response to that is that this is pure blood libel by the United Nations Secretary General. Mr. Guterres also went on to say that hopes of a political solution are vanishing. And in here, the Israelis are to blame. The Palestinian leadership is also to blame, but Israel has responded to this by saying that this is clear victim blaming. Hamas are the new Nazis. Now, Israel continues to hit back at the United Nations Secretary General, with the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen, in fact, tweeting, and this is part of our Motorola India's best 5G smartphone brands tweet of the day.
Hello, Moto.
This is what the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen has said: I will not meet with the UN Secretary General after October 7th massacre. There is no place for a balanced approach. Hamas must be erased off the face of the planet. All right, so let's go to our big debate tonight, debate one here on Brass Tacks. Should the rules of war, as the international community, as the UNSC has demanded that Israel follow, should those rules of war apply to terrorists as well?
Hello, Moto.
All right, I've got a special panel joining us this evening. Daniel Karman is former Israeli ambassador to India. He's joining us live from Tel Aviv. Mona Alam is a senior Pakistani journalist joining us from Islamabad. Navdeep Suri, former Indian diplomat, and Professor Peter Kuznick is director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Karman, let me start with you first. What the international community, and you heard what Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has been saying, other ambassadors, particularly in the Gulf Arab countries, have been saying at the UNSC, that Israel cannot go in with this blank check, that Israel has to follow the rules of war. My question to you is, clearly Hamas or Lashkar-e-Taiba or Boko Haram or Al-Qaeda are not following these rules of war, but civilized states, states which believe in the rule of law, there is a higher standard expected of them, or at least that was the subtext of the debate that happened in the UNSC. How do you respond to that?
Well, first, let me go back to yesterday's statement by the Secretary General. The Secretary General of the United Nations is expected not to give interpretations of his own and not to take sides and not to tell under which umbrella or vacuum or non-vacuum these atrocities were committed. And I don't have to tell you, you've seen all the videos, what atrocities have been committed. The same United Nations cannot, up to date, even define what terror is. We all know what terrorism is.
Yep.
Terror is terror is terror. Definitely India knows what terror is. Israel knows what terror is. But the United Nations have not, up to date, defined it. And by the way, there is a big Indian effort to lead a process of defining what terrorism is, but it's unsuccessful, and I think it shows something about the United Nations and its efficiency. I'm not in government anymore, and I have to tell you that I suggested in my tweet, if I may say so, our foreign minister not to go to the Security Council. It was a hopeless debate. We didn't think the Secretary General would speak that badly about almost justifying what happened with Hamas on the 7th of October. But he did go, he did speak, he did cancel the meeting with the Secretary General. I know that the Secretary General has tried to correct himself today, but he hasn't apologized. We definitely expect an apology from a Secretary General of an organization where we are stakeholders and shareholders exactly as any member state.
Okay.
A deficiency, one more sentence, please. A deficiency of the international community, and I think you hinted to it, that there are rules of war, but the non-state actors in the rules of war are not treated as they should be. And the international community should make a big effort to adjust to the new kind of battlefield. And the new kind of battlefield, and you know it in India, is also terrorism.
So let me ask Navdeep Suri this. It's no one's case, Ambassador Suri, that there is no political underlying cause. Howsoever justifiable the political underlying cause may be, what is unjustifiable, what is almost unconscionable, is kidnapping 85-year-old grandmothers, is killing young 6-year-old baby Moshe's parents, both of them in front of his eyes. Clearly, no cause in the world justifies that kind of action. And the point that Ambassador Carmen made, I think it's well taken. India has been pushing for this. Surely the international community can come together to agree that this is terrorism and this is unacceptable. Whether Hamas carries it out, or Lashkar-e-Taiba carries it out, or Boko Haram carries it out, or Al-Qaeda carries it out, you cannot attack innocent, non-combatant civilians, howsoever justifiable you have a political grievance. Ambassador Suri.
So I think there's zero justification for terrorism, and what Hamas did was an absolutely abhorrent act of terror. Let's not dispute that. Let's use that as the starting point. I also want to compliment the work that Ambassador Daniel Carmen has been doing on the side for the hostages that are still held by Hamas. But I think the point that I have been trying to make is that states are held to a different standard because they have signed up to international conventions that terrorist organizations are not liable for. States sign up to the Geneva Convention. States sign up to other international agreements on how civilians are to be treated in a war situation. And I think that's where part of the debate. The debate is not whether Hamas is a terrorist organization or not. The debate is not on what Hamas did was a terrorist act or not. But what next? We know it was a terrorist act. But does Israel, as a responsible, civilized state, deserve to be held to a higher standard than a terrorist organization? And I believe that for the respect that we have for Israel, it should be held to a higher standard. And this is something that many in Israel are saying, that we need to be different from the terrorists.
Absolutely. If I may, and I want to come to the wall to just bring in a bit of an intervention there. I absolutely agree with you that the rules that govern nation states, the civilized world, has to be to a higher level than the rules by which terrorist organizations operate. I absolutely agree with you on that. The problem is also, Ambassador Suri, that these terrorist organizations do not operate in vacuum. Clearly, we know here in India, and we've been at the receiving end of this, that Lashkar-e-Taiba is supported actively by a state actor, right? Similarly, Hamas, although neither the Israelis nor the Americans have put out any evidence in the public domain yet, but the scale of those attacks that we saw on October 7th, Hamas has not acted in isolation. Clearly, there were state support for Hamas from some players in that region. Again, I don't want to name countries. What happens to that? What happens to the state actors? Yes, the non-state actors don't have to play by the rules that civilized states have set for themselves. But what about the state support that these organizations get, Ambassador Suri?
So I think without naming it, you are suggesting Iran, and I think there is enough circumstantial evidence to indicate that Iran's hand is behind Hamas. You know, we will debate for some time to come whether they actually green-lighted the terrorist attack, whether they provided logistical support or whatever. But Iran is already under a whole slew of international sanctions. Iran is under US sanctions for a variety of reasons. There's the whole issue about Iran's nuclear program. beyond Iran's nuclear program, there's the
Let's go to
whole
the
issue of its interference in the affairs of its neighbors, starting from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain to UAE to Iraq to Syria and Lebanon. And we're aware of that. But where does that take us? So are you going to put more sanctions on Iran, which is the most sanctioned country in the world today? Do that. Does that solve any problem? Are you going to physically attack Iran and then deal with the consequences of a wider regional conflict? So I really don't understand where this takes us. Yes, we know that Iran openly supports groups from the Houthis in Yemen, all the way to Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. And then, what's the next step? And I keep asking this question because I don't know what happens the day after. I really, this is a time for anyone who loves the region as I do, a time for profound pessimism, where we can talk about destroying Hamas, but we are not willing to explore what happens after that. Yep. In terms of durable peace in the region.
No, again, to that extent, I absolutely agree with Ambassador Suri. If Israel's plan is to go in and cut Hamas off its knees, make sure that Hamas militarily is not in a position ever, as Netanyahu said, for the next 50 years, to be able to launch an attack on Israel like it did on October 7th, you are not going to achieve that by just a military operation. You are certainly not going to achieve that by going in for a military operation, completing that military operation, and then leaving a vacuum behind, because that vacuum is only going to breed another Hamas. But be that as it may, I'm getting a piece of breaking news before I go to the other guests who are waiting. Israel has now agreed to delay its ground operations, its ground invasion into Gaza. This is on the request of the United States. And the reason the US has asked for this and has made this request of Israel is so that the US can get its own missile defenses in place in the region to protect American troops, whether this is in Syria or in Iraq or in Yemen. US defenses want to bring in missile defense systems so that American troops who are working in the wider region, they are protected. So, Professor Kuznick, clearly America is also caught in a bind. Last week, when this debate happened in the UNSC, out of the 15 member states, I think 14 of them voted, or at least were against Israel. America, by virtue of being a permanent member and by virtue of having a veto power, was the only country that vetoed that suggestion, right? So America, on the one hand, has to throw its weight entirely behind Israel. But at the same time, as Ambassador Suri said, and others have been saying, civilized countries, nation states, need to be held up to a different standard than terrorist organizations. And if that means that civilized states have to take extra protection or make sure that civilians are not harmed, if you want to go after the terrorists, go after the terrorists, but you cannot have large-scale killing of civilians, then that's a standard, that's a burden that Israel has to carry.
Yes, what Hamas did was unconscionable, unforgivable, has to be universally condemned, and the Hamas leaders have to be held accountable. But what Israel is doing in response is shocking the world right now. We know that almost half the population in Gaza are children. According to the figures I've seen, perhaps 40% of all those killed in the Israeli bombing attacks so far have been children. These people are not guilty. So what's going on is a form of collective punishment. And collective punishment is against international law. So Israel does have to be held to a much higher standard than Hamas. And unfortunately, Israel's actions are compromising its moral authority in the world and uniting much of the world against it, even though there was so much sympathy for Israel in the beginning. Maybe not universal as there should have been. And then, but when the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations condemns Guterres for saying that this didn't occur in a vacuum, He is not defending what Hamas did by any means, and he hasn't, and he shouldn't. But he's saying there's a long history here, and if we're going to get beyond this ever, if we're going to be able to solve this at some point, then we're going to need to understand the provocations on all sides, because everybody is to blame here. The United States is, Israel is, the Palestinians are, Turkey with its recent statements. I mean, there's enough blame to go around.
Yeah.
And we've got looking at it from the standpoint how we settle this at some point in the future, because this has gone on for many, many decades and is going to continue. If they kill people they kill the Hamas leadership, they don't end Hamas. Hamas is an idea. It's a movement. Many of us may deplore certain aspects of it, but it's not going to it can't be solved militarily. And I wish the people in the region would understand that.
Before I go to Mona Alam, and I want to go across to that wall, I want to get a quick response from Ambassador Carmen, because both Ambassador Suri and Professor Kuznick are saying pretty much the same thing. A, that civilized states have signed up to treaties and conventions. As a diplomat, you will agree with the principle that countries like Israel, India, the United States have to live up to a certain higher standard. And two, the very practical sort of problem that Israel confronts is, in the aftermath of October 7th, the moral high ground was with Israel. But the longer this ground operation continues and the more civilian casualties there are, the more pictures of children getting killed in rocket attacks and in airstrikes and the subsequent ground invasion that is imminent anytime now, Israel loses that moral high ground, whether it's in the UN Security Council or whether it is in the court of global opinion. How do you respond to that, Ambassador Carmen?
Well, I would start by saying I would caution very much the data and the information that the other side, that Hamas, gives out to the public. And I think that we've heard at least 3 or 4 world leaders who have said one way or the other, we don't have to believe Hamas propaganda anymore. And I just give you an example. The hospital that was hit by a Islamic Jihad rocket, when Israel was accused that it bombed it, it was 500 people that were, so to speak, hit. But when the world understood that it's a failed launch of a rocket, all of a sudden the Hamas narrative changed, and there were only few dozens of people who were hit in the hospital. And with this game of propaganda, we have to live. So I would caution very much what my predecessor has said about half the people are children, etc., etc. I would caution, because it's those are this is the propaganda of the minute.
Okay.
When you said about moral high ground, I must tell you something that maybe you haven't heard before, but we need the moral high ground for ourselves, first of all, not for the world. The world comes second. First of all, we have to be sure that when we send our kids, and I have a daughter in the army, when we send our kids to the army to fight those murderers who did such atrocities with our people, innocent Israeli and foreigners, we want to be sure that when they fight, they do not lose the moral high ground. And it's first and foremost for ourselves. Now, what we have on the ground, the ground assault has not started yet, by the way.
Yeah.
But the Palestinians have, the non-involved Palestinians have gotten a request or a suggestion to go to a specific area where they will be safe. Those who went there will be safe. Those who stuck with Hamas, or those who were obliged by Hamas to stay in the area, this could be what is called the collateral damage. But they've had a week now. They might have a few more days to go south of the Gaza River, it's called. Go south, you will not be hurt, and you will get humanitarian help there.
Okay.
Those things are taken care of.
Okay. I want to also bring in a quote that has just come some time back, and this is attributed to the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He's made a big statement in Istanbul just a short while back, Mr. Erdogan, the elected leader of Turkey, has said that Hamas is not a terrorist organization. Mr. Erdogan, the elected leader of Turkey, has said that Hamas is not a terrorist organization, but it's a group of liberation, that Hamas is trying to save its homeland. Mr. Erdogan goes on to say that it's actually Israel which is acting like a terror group. And I want to ask Mona Alam this. This is not some person who's at the fringes of international geopolitics. This is the elected leader of a very influential power in the Middle East, simply refusing to acknowledge the kind of crimes that Hamas carried out on October 7th. Forget about that for a moment. There are still, by Israeli accounts, by American accounts, at least 200 hostages, people who were taken hostage on the 7th of October, who are still in Hamas custody. How can these guys not be called a terror organization? At the very least, they are kidnappers, they are murderers, they are extortionists. I mean, if they were really interested in peace, all they need to do is to return those hostages. Why did they take the hostages in the first place? What do those hostages have to do anyway with the ongoing Israeli-Palestine confrontation, which has been going on for the better part of the last 70 years? Mona Alam.
Well, Zaka, actually, the casualties of children and women and unarmed civilians being claimed are questionable. But, you know, as a basic principle, of course, I would agree with everybody here. Unarmed civilians and being attacked, unarmed civilians in the garb of any excuse, any reason is extremely unjustifiable. Nobody ever can justify this. But having said that, the issue doesn't just arise yesterday or doesn't just arise on the October 7th. This is almost a decade-long issue, which is primarily about, you know, the right of self-determination for the Palestinians. And this is where it has started from. I'm so sorry to just observe the entire world and primarily the superpowers, the global superpowers. I thought you quoted accounts of both US and Israel. And ironically, they're both one and the same thing. They're hand in glove. But the problem is nobody, and especially the two of them, are not talking about the resolution of the matter, which happens to be the Palestinian and Israeli conflict at hand. It has been almost a decade since, you know, this entire issue is going on and on. Chemical weapons have been used against the Palestinian people. We must also not let go or forego those facts. These are all facts.
But Mona Alam, if you agree with the, I don't know if you do agree with this contention by Erdogan that Hamas is not a terrorist organization, then you should also call the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan not a terrorist organization. They're a liberation movement. The Baloch Liberation Army should also be called that. They're not a terrorist organization, but that's not how I remember Pakistan characterizing either of these groups.
I may counter that argument because they do not have a grievance to start off with. I mean, Balochistan, it happens to be a sovereign part of Pakistan, and if there are some people who want Balochistan as a separate homeland, then, I mean, they're pursuing it against the state of Pakistan. Balochistan is not a conflicted territory.
India makes the same argument in Kashmir. I've never seen you accept that Kashmir is a sovereign part of India, and if some people want to fight, then that's a fight against the Indian state. I can extend that same argument. You've never taken that position on any of our shows.
Because we've always spoken about Kashmir, and Kashmir also happens to be very synonymous to the issue of Palestine. I mean, you talk about UN resolutions, it happens to be a conflicted territory. The people, the inhabitants of the land still have to have their right of self-determination.
That's what I'm saying. By that same logic, so do the Balochis, right? By that same logic, so do the Balochis. What are the Buktis fighting for? They're fighting for their, as you said, quote unquote, right to self-determination.
Land, that is where the differentiation arises, Zaka.
Okay, so Balochistan was never contested land, but Kashmir and Israel are contested. What about Israel's sovereign rights? Does it not have any sovereign rights?
Of course it does. Of course it does. But
can I intervene with the...
Yes, Ambassador Carmen. Yes,
Israel
yes.
is back.
Yeah, if I can intervene and remind
your
audience that in 2006, Israel went out of Gaza. We disengaged from Gaza. Gaza became an autonomous territory, and the first thing that happened then was an overthrow, a military coup by Hamas against the Palestinian Authority. And atrocities were carried out by Hamas. Hamas, who some say is not a terrorist organization, atrocities against the Palestinian Authority people who were kicked out towards the West Bank, and it became Hamastan. It became Hamastan, and unfortunately, they went from strength to strength, and we reached the situation in which we were on the 7th of October, which is something we still cannot understand.
There are state links to every non-state entity. Nobody denies, and non-state entities cannot flourish on their own. They cannot function on their own without state supports. This is undeniable, and of course.
So which is the state, Mona, that is behind Lashkar-e-Taiba, that is behind Jaish-e-Mohammed? Surely they can't also survive without some kind of state support.
I don't think they're surviving because they're as good as gone. They're in house arrests. Their leaders are in house arrests. There've been also reports that their children were, I think, attacked or kidnapped some days ago. You know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. But I mean, they're not in a good position. The last attack that they did was, I think, 26/11. That was years ago. No matter how sorry that attack was, how unfortunate that attack was, but it's been a while. They're not functional, as you say.
Ambassador Suri wants to come in. It's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to respond in a way to, no dispute that Hamas is a terrorist organization, but I think there are two elements that should be, if we want to keep this a fact-based discussion, there are two elements that we need to take into account. One, yes, Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2006, but Israel continued to exercise complete control on airspace, on access, on airport, on ports, on fishing, all of that. And that is why Gaza is called the world's largest open-air jail, that it was in a very controlled space where people are unable to really exercise any aspirations. The second aspect really is something that is being discussed intensely in Israeli media, but is glossed over in our discussions, is the relationship that has existed between the Israeli intelligence and Hamas since 2006 and actually since 1980s, if one were to take a longer term view. There were clear arrangements, and there was a rationale for those arrangements, I think, from an Israeli government perspective, which was to deny a two-state solution for as long as possible. You create a division in the Palestinian entity. You have the PLO, or the Palestine Authority, which is only West Bank. You have a separate entity called Hamas in Gaza. And who do you talk to? How do you create a two-state solution? There's been, I think, the reason why we are in this place today partly is the unwillingness of successive Israeli governments to take forward the idea of a two-state solution and to actually create a reality on the ground today where no matter what you do, it's going to be really, really, really hard to create a two-state solution. So what do you do?
Okay.
I keep asking this question. There is the now and immediate, and that's what news is interested in, and it's important to focus. But what happens the day after?
Okay. I'll leave it at that because I'm completely out of time. But I think the Israeli response, the Israeli counter-argument to that was, because of whom did Camp David fall through? Because of whom did the Oslo peace process fall through? Yitzhak Rabin died for peace. The proposal that he had put up, why did that fall through? When Ehud Barak was prime minister, the proposal that he had put up, why did that fall through? So anyway, I don't want to go back into history, but yes, I will conclude, and I'll take a break on this note that yes, Israel right now, the wounds are so fresh, it's so raw, the images from October 7th are so real and so upfront that right now what that country requires, and this is the assessment of the political leadership there, is some form of retribution. And if that means militarily cutting Hamas's legs off, then that's what it entails. But how do you ensure that there isn't another Hamas coming up, or there isn't another entity that comes up once this military operation concludes, once there is a vacuum, what replaces Hamas should also be thought through, because that's not the question for the day after tomorrow. That's the question you plan for today, so that you know when that question confronts you the day after tomorrow what the answer might be.